Helix view towards Industry 6.0. So, Professor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I say hello to everybody present. Thank you for your time and interest. And again, grateful for your support and hospitality, starting with Joanna Morawska and Pavel Chersky and all others. Now, we have had a number of interactions so far, and today's material will complement and build with some overlap the previous discussions. Before I go into specifics, first of all, we have until 12 noon your time. Is this correct? Just to be clear. Roughly.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So I basically wanted to reflect a little bit on what is going on. In 3 days, we have Victory Europe Day, VE Day, which signified and still I think is a very important anniversary in the struggle against totalitarianism, and in particular the Nazi regime in Germany. Russia at the time played a very important role. We have to recognize that, as well as many others, including Poland and other countries. And so now, unfortunately, we're concerned about whether that anniversary will have other implications in what is going on next door, the Ukrainian tragedy, as I would call it. And this is something that I think we should keep in the back of our mind. Just a second, please. Sorry about that. I wanted to make sure we reflect on that, because this is something that matters. Okay, and so the title today, Democracy in the Environment as Endangered Species, in fact, is the title of an interview I gave in November 2020, and this has been published online, where I, and it builds on prior works and publications we have been producing and publishing over the last 15 years, looking at the bigger picture, which is a struggle. With the onset of the 21st century, there's a struggle that has been effectively become more clear between what I would call developed democracies and emerging autocracies. So the unfortunate, tragic situation in Eastern Europe right now is just, I think, one of the manifestations of this struggle, and hopefully it will be contained and reduced and just remain a bad memory, but we don't know yet. So we need to think about what we can do in the developed democracies camp, because this is not insignificant, even in the context of who opposed in the United Nations and elsewhere the actual, well, what is some call a military operation, which is really a full-scale invasion of a sovereign country. 2/3 of the countries and 2/3 of the population are with countries that actually do not openly, explicitly, directly oppose what's happening on Earth and on the planet. So this is something we need to be very mindful of. It's not clear that the majority, let's say, of people, as far as their representation goes, which of course is too much autocratic and not democratic and representative enough, appear to be at least neutral, if not even supportive of this. So what can be done? I have been discussing ideas, and this is the issues that we need to address, because in addition now to the struggle between democracies and autocracies, there is things that are happening in the natural world, on the climate, that is, and they converge and corroborate and exacerbate these, the fallout of the struggle between democracies and autocracies. And so the climate change creates a lot of disruptions and, in fact, feeds onto populism, creates a lot of additional inequalities and makes democracies appear increasingly ineffective and inefficient. And this is part of the discussion here, how to become more effective and efficient, how to minimize and ideally abolish waste and corruption and pollution going forward, and win over the hearts of the citizens. We saw recently what happened in France. Thankfully, Macron won, but what is, I think, more sobering is the percentage that the alternative option received. So, you know, it is a difficult time we live in. And unfortunately, instead of benefiting and enjoying the end of the Cold War, we have been going into a new cold peace, perhaps I would call it. The concept of the quintuple innovation helix, therefore, that we discussed before, and I'll briefly revisit, and even what referred to in the title as Industry 6.0 are very, I think, pertinent and poignant, even meaningful concepts in this context. How to look at, have a holistic, integrative approach in our design for regional economic development, but also at the country and continent level, and focus on leveraging technology and harmonizing, in a sense, people, culture, and technology dynamics to connect and leverage and complement as much as possible the people and the technology and institutions to maximize benefits and minimize costs and minimize cynicism also. This is part of the whole theme here, okay? So a theme that we revisit now, eco-innovation. The UN, of course, is looking forward and always building towards a better tomorrow. That's their job. Doesn't mean that their goals are always achieved or even are feasible. But having ambitious goals is an important, in a way, prerequisite for making substantive progress, even if you don't meet the goals themselves. So there are technologies, as we see, like biotechnology, nanotechnology, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, robotics, and others that can make and are already bringing significant changes to the economy and society, but that is not fully both developed and leveraged and even understood. This is where the industry and society 5.0 and then the 6.0 vision try to incorporate the possibilities and address challenges and opportunities. Along with the climate, as I mentioned, and the theme for today's discussion, the democracy and climate, are they endangered species? I mean, this is a rhetorical question. Of course, I do believe they are. And I do believe that in the process, our way of life in terms of a democratic, developed democracies and reasonably prosperous and robust and resilient economies and societies is at risk. Along with the environmental challenges, we have, as also partly the environment changes, but also other factors. We have, of course, public health challenges, the pandemic that has not been fully addressed. It remains a source of risk and a substantial potential disruptor going forward. And so we're trying to do the best we can in the context of significant change and disruption. The main motivation is to aim for a more human-centric approach, so that, for instance, the triple helix context and concept, that focuses on government, university, and industry only. This is really a top-down approach. That is really ennobling and empowering autocracies, at least indirectly, even unintentionally. And there is a reason why over the years this has been a very popular concept for policy making and development and practices in more autocratic contexts and regimes. The motivation here is how can we be more human-centric, so we balance a technocentric, inevitably technology impetus and influence, trying to leverage the technological advantages, so that people do not feel excluded, they feel more empowered than threatened. And then, in fact, innovation is richer if you think about it. And you look at these concepts here: broad-based innovation, open innovation, lead user innovation, user-oriented innovation, and the concept that I have developed with colleagues over the years, global, local, targeted open innovation. The implication here being that we recognize and realize that innovation is not truly ever open unconditionally. It has to align, the openness has to be aligned and justified through business and technology strategy, priorities and objectives, whether it is at the micro firm organizational level or at the meso or macro levels even. I mean, a country itself will not, and you see that, by the way, with regards to different countries, how open or not they are, and what obstacles or barriers, or explicit or disguised, they raise against global trade, unfettered, unlimited, and unimpeded global trade. So that has been an issue and a wake-up call, a realization for the World Trade Organization objectives and efforts. Globalization has become much more glocalization, meaning an increasing focus on local and an increasing focus on bilateral relationships, and also a move away from multi-stakeholder institutions, that global institutions, that has, of course, good reasons why it's been happening. Again, this is part of the ineffectiveness and inefficiency, both the reality and the perception underlying this, but also, of course, politics and populism. So now we need to figure out better ways to reinvigorate and revitalize these institutions, these multi-stakeholder global institutions, because they're really the vanguards, they're the champions, if you wish, and proponents of open societies and democratic and climate friendly, of course, development and prosperity. Now, this certainly relates to social innovation, where citizens and civil society in general assume and maintain an increasingly important and influential role in developing policies and practices and economic development. That fits well within the quadruple and quintuple innovation Helix frameworks, which is really government, university, industry, as well as civil society and the environment put together. They align well, they are useful, I think, and compatible platforms for Society 5.0 and Industry 5.0 policies and practices and the concepts themselves. So what could be examples of a social innovation? We have certainly the efforts to assimilate refugees and not just help them, but actually integrate them in the economy and the society. It's a very important context of social innovation. Again, creating a solution to a societal problem, leveraging technology and other, media, social media, and so forth, but also advancing entrepreneurship and innovation agendas in this context, giving more opportunities to more people. And this is about, again, helping displaced people that may be refugees from abroad for a given country, or may be internally displaced, unemployed, and what have you. And this is also very important. Again, winning hearts and minds in the sense for democracies is critical to ensure that you integrate as fast and effectively and efficiently. And at the same time, avoiding the impoverishment of the middle class, whether it has to do with mitigating the impact of energy price fluctuations and all the other issues that are connected with this. Again, emanating from the crisis in Eastern Europe, but also in general the the effort to transition towards more environmentally friendly sources of energy generation inevitably would create this kind of disruption that has been simply compounded and even partly disguised by the impact of the crisis. We would still have energy price issues. And so how you deal with that, how governments as well as the societies and the private sector and the NGOs adapt and adjust to cope with this and safeguard the coherence and cohesion of societies and the economies is very important. And this, in this context, what we call a digital ecosystem is an important factor, an important asset in this regard. Connecting people digitally is not just a nice or even fancy thing to do, but actually has to do with giving them more opportunities, and in the context and in light of pandemic lockdowns or other types of exclusion in the physical sense, they are able to connect with the world and compensate these limitations. But again, I keep coming back to this because we need to remember and realize, as always, that innovation is not an easy undertaking. It needs patience, persistence. I'll talk about the 7 Ps concept: patient, persistent, proactive, predictive, preventive, preemptive, and one more. But anyway, the idea is that we are looking at how to have long-term horizon. This is a challenge, by the way, and this is not just an interesting observation. This is a very critical, very important, if you wish, challenge for democracies. Democracies, understandably and inevitably and appropriately, to a great extent, operate with a shorter term horizon approach, because those who make policies, the elected officials, to some extent at least, they are always focusing on the next election, which should not be too many years away. So that's really the effective length of the immediate horizon and the focus. Innovation requires much longer term thinking. So having a civil service, and this is again the role of civil society and other institutions, balancing the process and the dynamics of democracy, that actually can focus on the longer term and in that sense work around innovation priorities and pursuits and goals in a manner that is more, again, effective and efficient, rather than starting from scratch after each election and not really caring much about what might happen beyond the next election is critical. I mean, to really make this not just effective and efficient, but to really have a chance to make a difference. So this is the big change, big difference and big challenge for democracies versus autocracies that, of course, have the luxury of lifelong, so to speak, service, public in quotes, service or self-service. This, just a couple of things just to reference, if you wish, the related research. There are different projects like Edward Elgar handbooks that you see here that are they have been recently coming to a closure, a conclusion. They should be released sometime in 2022. This has been around for the last 10 years, and this is actually a second edition. And it's ongoing online as well as in print, and contributions are welcome. It brings together important concepts of creativity, invention, innovation, entrepreneurship in this Springer encyclopedia. I think it's a useful platform, and then related also to the theme of a presentation coming up, I believe on May 10th, or is it? Yeah, May 10th, on cyber development, democracy, defense, and diplomacy. There is already some publications out on the cyber V3, not 4, so far. So the context, this is the problem. It's about making the world safe for democracy, Chamberlain, I believe, the Prime Minister of Britain in 1938, coming back from the Munich meetings, said we have peace in our time. Of course, tragically wrong, and this is the point, making the world safe for democracy, but also democracy safe for the world. We need both, and we need to make sure that we achieve and maintain a sustainable pathway forward, balancing both of these concepts that are not trivial in my mind. And imagination as well as knowledge, to quote Einstein here again, is very important in this regard. It's not just about attacking or tackling problems in an incremental manner, thinking inside or even outside the box. We need to think beyond the box to address our challenges here. And we'll come to that in the follow-up slides, discussion of practices or proposed methodologies. The bigger context, again, for we proceed, is the Sustainable Development Goals. These have no, they're open-ended really. They aim for 2030, but there's no way that this will happen given what's been developing. But there is also developments and progress in things that are unexpected in many of these areas. And again, this is the question of the role of technology, getting beyond the challenges, geopolitical and others, that are flaring up from time to time. The quadruple and the quintuple helix concepts, just a reminder of how we can think of those, and that in the heart, at the core of the quintuple helix is academia, with the other dimensions building on it and the environment surrounding everybody. Now, how do we achieve this kind of effective and efficient approach should really be at the heart of developing policies and practices that are taking into account all 5 dimensions and leverage as appropriate and integrate as possible institutions across all 5 dimensions. This is not easy. There are cultural divides, there are political divides, there are institutional divides, and even technological incompatibilities that remain major challenges in many regards, both at the national and talking about Europe at the European continental levels. And this is, I think, in our lifetime and in the coming decades, these are things that hopefully will be more fully addressed. This is where society and industry 5.0 and hopefully 6.0 will make a difference and will help streamline further the integration. Now, how could this happen? What does it mean really to incorporate or use the helices, in this case the quadruple helix, as a guideline for planning policies and practices? We can think of, or we can take into consideration, technological, institutional, behavioral, and cultural dimensions, and for instance, transparency of government policy making, quality of government and governance index, and so forth, as well as quality of the educational system, and networking, opportunity perception, but also things like no fear of failure. These are bigger challenges. They require, longer term cultural transformation, role models, and so forth. These are important aspects of what one should look at and take into account, have in mind when designing initiatives and interventions. Again, Industry 5.0 is an approach, again, endorsed by the European Commission last year, and it aims beyond efficiency and productivity. It reinforces the role and the contribution of industry to society. But what does that really mean? It's about being more sustainable, human-centric, and resilient European industry, but also, I would say, and this is a connection to Society 5.0, society. Okay, so this shows the evolution across the different paradigms, starting with the first industrial revolution, Industry 1.0, and then going to the 5.0 today. And Society 5.0 in this context is about people, okay, putting human beings at the center of innovation, And in a sense, this is a complementary and reinforcing concept and aspect to Industry 5.0, to bring together different aspects of economy and society, and knowledge economy in particular, and society in the context of developed democracies. Now, the hope and the aspiration, especially after the end of the Cold War, was that openness and integration in institutions like the World Trade Organization and so forth would really help transform both societies and economies, and by extension, the political regimes in more autocratic settings. That has not come to happen. In fact, Russia was never allowed into the World Trade Organization, partly because of their focus on raw materials and their unwillingness in a way to coordinate and align in this regard. But China was allowed. In fact, it used this going back 20 years. 20 years ago, 2001, it was allowed into the World Trade Organization, and it just used this to enrich and empower itself to become more sustainable, robust, and resilient autocracy. So this is not, I think, a smart approach. We'll talk about smarter societies next. We need to learn our lessons, and we cannot ignore or forget them, because they will revisit us with a passion. So Society 5.0, again, it's technocentric and human-centric. And you see here the different aspects of society over the years. And then the idea is that technology increasingly comes to serve people in this regard, and to some extent, and appropriately so, becomes more transparent. As it matures, it becomes reliable, robust, and resilient. The solutions that technology supports that people use should allow for the technology per se to become less of a concern. Think of electricity. I mean, it's become so effective and efficient in most regards, the power grid and so forth, that we don't think about it. Of course, when we don't have it, it's a major issue nowadays. So dependence is a different matter. And this is, by the way, another aspect of all this, the frugal aspects of innovation and development, and in the context of sustainability, developing ways and means that we increasingly become less reliant on a centralized power grid and more able to locally, this is going back to the locally produce energy, among other things, to serve our needs, whether it's through renewable sources or even riding a bike to power our laptop and what have you. So this is, again, over time, the evolution of societal paradigms, and over the centuries and millennia even, how it came to be today, to a point where there is an effort towards what we call super smart society. Again, we need to take all these terms with a grain of salt, because these are more visions than realities. Very helpful to drive, as I said, progress and help improve things as much as possible, even if they themselves prove to be more fleeting as goals, less achievable or feasible, certainly taking longer to happen. Okay, so super smart society could be the context or a reality where society is fully engaged, people are empowered and connected. There is no private data breaches and other such concerns. Again, as corruption and pollution and other waste is better managed, hopefully, and not exacerbated using technology, these will prove to be more realistic and also visible as context, society, and Industry 5.0, that is, as contexts that are truly achievable, and they are truly sources of prosperity and benefits to all. Now, this obviously is, again, a vision and something to influence and inspire our policy making and practice implementation. All right, but this you see here, super smart society service platform, the different aspects of a super smart society in this regard. This is covering energy value chains, and the idea here would be, for instance, how could we leverage technology, and that would include artificial intelligence, to actually buffer, leverage, as well as filter opportunities, leverage opportunities, and filter out challenges to disruption disruptive challenges to power grids from energy price fluctuations. And this, ironically, in many countries in Europe, there was an effort because there was an expectation that energy would actually become cheaper over time before the conflict in the Ukraine and all that. And as a result, in many cases, governments chose to some extent, both privatize the power grid and also allow fluctuation in the prices to reflect market realities. In a way, they made households investors in the market, and in particular, if you think about it, investors in derivatives. But when you do that, when you invest in derivatives, and I don't want to go into this too much, but I'm sure perhaps most of you understand and know about this, you are supposed to develop and design and implement what we called covered, not naked, positions, hedged positions, where your exposure is limited and controlled to price fluctuations. And we'll talk about options and so forth. This, of course, never applied to households, and we have had cases where enormous price increases, in fact, not reduction in prices, has happened to the energy bills that households are receiving. Governments have had to, and are, as we speak, going through all kinds of efforts to mitigate that, but it's not easy to address given how it was done and roll back, because it can actually become a lot worse before it improves or stabilizes. And that in itself could be a very big source of cynicism and mistrust to the democratic system, and it could be a major boon to populism. So this could have serious knock-on effects for democracies in Europe, and this is a major concern. There's other things like smart manufacturing and new digital business models. I mentioned, I talked about the connectivity earlier, and sharing economy, as well as cyclical economy solutions like Airbnb and other such private companies. They have been providing solutions to engage people in an entrepreneurial manner and develop both local economies as well as societies. That actually has proven of great value during the crisis and during even the pandemic. So we need to be mindful and appreciative of these, as well as, of course, be aware of the risks, like with the energy value chains, of how we engage and leverage these possibilities. The global targeted open innovation theme is important in the Society 5.0 context, because we always need to realize and remember that we're locally active, present, and impacted, but with global connections nowadays. So both of these are important, and we also, again, need to remember and realize that choices, policies, and practices always, if they're to prove sustainable and realistic, they need to align with priorities in terms of business and technology strategy, as well as other constraints, limitations, and opportunities. It's not just open and free for all. So we see here different walls in the graphic that represent the different sources of disconnect, or a good part of those: institutional, legal, technological, human, and also social disconnects that they need to be bridged over. We are looking to develop digital social innovation ecosystems that will actually leverage and bring together different resources and aspects. And moving on to what that means practically, is very much about education, of course, because the human and intellectual capital is the foundation of what can happen and what could be more achievable and feasible over time. It needs to reflect a certain ethos, a certain mindset and a philosophy that has a balance and a harmony between technology, people, and culture. So it should be a balanced techno and human-centric approach. And this is the concept of the empowering capital. It builds on human, intellectual, financial, and social capital assets and resources. The connectivity, if it properly leverages and integrates such resources, could become extremely powerful and useful. And this is the context for developing our initiatives. A few comments briefly about what the European Commission sees as Industry 5.0. This is from this report, policy brief. And the idea is that they recognize that Industry 4.0 is too technocentric. We need more balanced human-centric approaches. Well, but again, this should not be about industry. That's why we've been discussing Society 5.0 as well. And hopefully this will become more explicitly integrated in the policy making and the thinking in Europe. As far as Industry 5.0, you see comparisons and contrasts with Industry 4.0 here, and we see the differences to some extent. The idea and what is important is to notice that indicators change, and this will take us to the next segment here, the discussion of how we can an approach, if you wish, for the next generation, what we call smarter and sustainable specialization strategies, next generation of policy making and planning using updated sets of indicators and looking at progress, defining progress to begin with, and then monitoring it and interpreting the findings or the values of the metrics in a manner that recognizes and respects even the well-being, resilience, and overall sustainability of both economy and society. So no more need to expand on this. Of course, this is about the circular economy. It is about the sharing economy. It is about moving towards renewable energy sources. The irony here is that politics has become, in a way, too much involved in this, because the reality is you cannot expand or develop solar power grids or wind farms and what have you overnight. And so in the short to medium term, unless you can remain or continue relying upon oil and gas and other sources, including coal and nuclear, you're going to have a problem, serious lack or serious inabilities to meet demand with the available supply of green enough, let's say, energy, or also politically correct enough energy. So as a result, we have been seeing what's happening here. I mean, there is a very interesting dance, if you wish, or game between the East and the West going on, with the requirement, the clause imposed, revealed and imposed on to pay in rubles, for instance, and how that actually has succeeded in dividing Europe. And this is a big problem. In addition to just having major European countries, such as Germany, continuing to buy Russian energy. Ironically, countries like Poland have become singled out, in effect, gas supply from Russia was interrupted, partly because Poland is trying to be more consistent with pronounced European policies and approaches. Here we have a situation where it's not clear how this will play out. And more importantly, and even beyond the Ukrainian tragedy, as I said before, this is about implications, strategic implications for energy policy in Europe. I think it is, in my mind, this is my view, it is unfortunate that coal and nuclear have been speedily or quickly, and lignite quickly excluded as sources of power before we were ready to transition reliably, effectively, and efficiently. And even without the crisis in the Ukraine, I mean, that simply revealed the poverty in the quality of policymaking and the even irresponsibility of governments and policymakers, just paying lip service to green goals and sustainable and so forth. Now, again, this is my view. All I'm saying is that I'd rather not be reliant on circumstances that are unacceptable and even in a sense financing aggression than in order to sort of overnight or very quickly exclude dirtier or less clean sources of energy. So there should be a more structured and more rational risk management and trade-offs assessment approach in this context, right? So this is a learning point here, and technology can help to a great extent both mitigate and, there are ways to have fairly clean energy generation using coal, for instance, and certainly nuclear, assuming you're not in a war zone, is not automatically a source of destruction and disruption. So we'll see what happens. I mean, as we know, ironically, France has about 85% of its energy needs covered by nuclear power generation. So this is, a counterexample to Germany. I applaud the green focus. This was triggered and driven after the Fukushima incident and disaster in Japan in 2011. But yeah, it's been almost more than 10 years now, and there should be more progress in this regard that hasn't been realized even before the Ukrainian challenges. And ironically, the Ukrainian crisis really started in 2014 with Crimea and so forth. So people should be aware and knowledgeable about the risk and increasing risk of disruptions for that. So there are serious responsibilities, I believe, in those who have authority and power and responsibility for that matter, as well as accountability. So what are the three principles of Industry 5.0? That sets the stage also for Industry 6.0, designing out waste and pollution, keep products and materials in productive use and circulation, and regenerate natural systems, as well as enhance carbon sinks. That means proactive, carbon capture technologies to deal with the greenhouse effect, the planetary warming, climate change issue, climate crisis now. These are all important and appropriate, and the promising and encouraging aspect of all this is there are significant components of the policy-making landscape for the Industry 5.0 at the European Commission level, where they look at, for instance, AI regulation, skills agenda, digital education, the Green Deal, and industrial strategy. There are issues here, however, that up to a point are easier to address and improve. Beyond the point, however, they touch on very both sensitive and very difficult questions that bring to the fore the issue of national sovereignty versus European commitment and responsibility. That applies to both large and small countries and has to do with things like, you know, your trading and commerce priorities and agenda. If you're a major exporter to China, let's say, how are you going to deal with implementing many of these goals that we look at here, and at the same time not seriously disrupt or come in conflict with your partners, whether in China or certainly other countries like Russia and so forth. So this is an open process right now, but at least we have an effort and a recognition to move in that direction that will, in a sense, force to the fore the questions, and hopefully then we'll start developing answers to them. So this is the expert group on the economic and societal impact of research and innovation that is aiming to frame such policies, and there are even going back to the days of, you know, in the 80s when total quality was a major priority and effort in quality management in the US, but also other countries. And there is the Malcolm Baldrige Award that was set up in 1987, I believe, to recognize companies, but also universities that were, and other institutions that were successful in incorporating in their practices total quality management practices, and they became certified in that sense regarding quality, but also waste and so forth. Here's a similar example, the Industry 5.0 award, and I think these are helpful tools for developing awareness, visibility, and inspire others to engage. I think 5.0 context, we talked about this before. Super smart is the goal here for Society 5.0, merging cyber and physical spaces, and things like you know, materials 5.0, smart materials that could be, for instance, wearables, as well as materials in many applications that are aware, in a sense, of the environment, and they adapt, and they also communicate with others to support predictive and proactive maintenance and so forth. Autonomous driving and autonomous decentralized cities are also other examples. The evolution obviously has been going on for centuries. It is not a linear process. It is not a process that has not had major disruptions and also leaps forward. So this is what we're looking at, and the cyber-physical space integration is a major frontier, so to speak, of challenge and opportunity today. The Industry 5.0 builds and integrates on the Industry 4.0 that came out of Germany primarily, and then Society 5.0 came out of Japan. And you see here the different attributes, design, objectives, and key phrases. How to advance this and move towards the next level, as I said already, is the challenge. Why do we do all that? At the end, of course, survival and physical safety and safety from hunger and violence and so forth are primary needs and objectives. And if you have a war, you can worry about quality of life, but in the bigger context and the longer term, this is what the priority should be. Enhancing and improving and sustaining a quality of life that is increasingly improving itself, that relates to clean environment, clean air and water, but also affordable health and education and opportunities that are equitable, and so forth. So this is about developing societies and economies in a manner that are people-friendly, and they are people or human-centric themselves. We don't just try to survive in them, and we're not being exploited by them. We actually thrive in them. This is the philosophy and the mindset. Examples you see here in more specific applications, obviously, and I don't mean to sound cynical here, but these are also, and you see the connection to companies like Hitachi and so forth. You know, this could be also product placement and brand promotion implicitly, but you know, it shows cases or examples where the cyber physical space can be further developed. For instance, in aging societies, moving towards the 100-year lifespan, you know, having monitoring robots by our side, developing a service to enable greater mobility, and developing you know, urban data and cyber-based data-driven planning. The metrics we see here are different indices, examples, index for predicting the drivers of societal issues, for evaluating societal issues, and for quality of life measurements. These are important aspects. And again, aside the product placement and brand promotion aside, there's another aspect, of course, there of the big brother. And we have that already. And this is why it's very critical to ensure that this cyber physical integration actually takes place in the context of democratic societies and economies, because we have social ranking schemes and other such big brother monitoring schemes already in place in autocracies, large Asian countries and others, and wherever that can happen, it is being done. If you have the purview and the in a way the degrees of freedom as an autocratic governing entity to implement them. So this is not, of course, what we would like to have happen. Always technology is a double-edged sword. So we see here cyberspace, using cyberspace to design urban transport infrastructure, and again, figuring out ways to deal with traffic congestion, and part of the smart cities implementation, connecting the physical with the cyber world, and that could apply to education. It could apply to simple, you know, societal coexistence. It could also relate to the development of new ways of collaboration. As we develop technologies for full immersion in a cyber or a digital sense, we increasingly have companies, for instance, organization, adopting this as a full-fledged option. For example, again, Airbnb recently announced that they will allow and endorse, in fact, virtual work all over the world. So whoever is an Airbnb employee can work from wherever in the world virtually and contribute to the company and be considered, you know, an employee in good standing, never really physically stepping or, you know, being physically in on the premises, corporate premises in San Francisco or what have you. So this is an interesting practice that the pandemic and other factors has been driving forward. You see another issue of modeling the real world, masochistic, non-masochistic, and satisfied energy saving schemes. That relates to the well-being factors or dimensions that feed directly into cynicism and other mindsets and attitudes, and relate in the end to how well populists may do. Things even that have to do with whether we have to be hot or cold to cope with our energy needs and related price increases. So time will reveal, the coming months and years will reveal the impact of energy on democracy per se, I'm afraid. And I hope we'll actually see more wisdom developed and implemented and more proactive and preventive schemes in the democracies rather than defensive and reactive and in the unfailing feeding populism. You know, by the way, in this context, almost more than 2/3 of citizens in Britain nowadays seriously and clearly, explicitly regret allowing Brexit to happen, and many of them did not expect it. This is part of the risk of complacency in democracies and low voter participation and comparative to organized interests and lobbies and what have you, less proactive and engaged attitudes. This needs always to be something we cope with and we try to mitigate, because major disruptions can happen. And again, the UK is an example. That actually in itself, and you know, this is going back to what they've been known to be active measures coming out of the big country to the east of Europe, that they actually have been in place over the decades during the Cold War and continued thereafter. They manifested themselves in the impact on elections in the US, and tragically, ironically, by the way, the 4 years of an administration that resulted from active meddling and intervention in the US elections impacted the composition of the Supreme Court. And just the other day, they allowed states to abolish or roll back the gains of what we call the Roe versus Wade decision from the 70s that relate to allowing you know, the right of abortion to women. It's not about your position or your thinking in terms of whether that should be allowed or not. It's about the implications and what will happen. The you know, back alley efforts to have abortions under risky conditions and all kinds of other things. And this is incredible. Many people, and that in itself is bad, but it also has knock-on, as I said before, effects like energy. That has knock-on effects in polarization and cynicism and hurting democracy. So that is the US. Then you have the United Kingdom. Then you have many countries in Europe where there's been intervention. These are not unconnected, okay? And in my mind, we look at the context and the angle of what democracies, developed democracies, and even developing democracies, more importantly, perhaps, can do to advance a better, you know, the pathway towards a better tomorrow. Well, on the other side is the question of what autocracies have been doing and have been scheming and planning. And there are many trends and developments that may or may not be connected, but there are certainly factors leading towards similar results, which is an increased displacement, whether economically, socially, or politically, of democracies around the world, and a growth in the influence and presence of autocracies. And as I said before, 2/3 of countries are at least passive, if not outright supportive of what's happening in Ukraine right now. So, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative, that includes all kinds of initiatives and actions and projects, whether it is construction projects in Poland, for that matter, or other parts of the world. The pandemic that really disrupted and displaced activities and our way of life of open societies. I mean, inevitably, to survive, we ended up accepting lockdowns, and you know, just at the personal level, accepting wearing masks and so forth. there is a symbolic aspect behind all this. And of course, outright aggression that is being manifested, and I sincerely pray and hope it will stop both in Ukraine and will stay in Ukraine, by the way. And then other things. So all of these, in my mind, are not necessarily disconnected, okay? Anyway, let me continue with this. So modeling the real world is about bringing together an understanding of the physical and the cyber, and there's this interesting concept of digital twins, cyber physical instances, modeling in the virtual space what could be in the real space, and also learning from the real space to guide and drive our creativity in the virtual space. And this is a bi-directional type of synergy that is mutually complementing and reinforcing. So there's physical and digital instances of solutions that we call digital twins in that regard. So you see here the physical and the cyberspace, data, information, and knowledge all coming together. I talked about what I call KID, not childish, analytics, to emphasize the need for, and the understanding that there has to be a fusion of knowledge, information, and data analytics, and of course, ensure that it serves people and not the other way around. It doesn't invade and control their life. You see here examples, and you see how they could be serving and adapting society and adapting infrastructures, whether it's smart cities infrastructures or environmental policies and practices, traffic, energy generation. This is another case in point, again, from the Japanese perspective. Again, there is a simplification to some extent, or an assumption that many things can happen in a way that obviously reflects the Japanese culture, which is actually, Japan, I would say, is reasonable to say, thanks to a great extent the wisdom of the U.S. after the end of the Cold War, the Second World War, the Więcej, Victory Japan Day. They helped them develop the democratic institutions, but they retain, they have an emperor still, and they retain many aspects of rather hierarchical and, in that sense, autocratic culture. And that is an interesting example, because that is reflected in many ways in what in the cyber physical context, right? So it's not fully comparable and portable to other, let's say, European contexts. I think it would be more challenging in the European context to develop such pilots and initiatives, but that doesn't mean it is not happening or it cannot happen. You see here another example with different facilities, smart city and habitat innovation example. The idea is that we bring together different sources of energy storage, solutions for energy storage, and the effectively the development overall of an area energy management system, as well as building energy management system and home energy management system. So the idea is that you have at the regional, if you wish, but also local levels, and then of course at the country level and beyond, you have systems that are integrated and developed to interoperate and collaborate. Another example is in transportation, smart roads, and other modalities like smart waste containers and so forth. The asphalt itself, it's not mentioned here, but there are technologies nowadays where asphalt on the roads can actually have the features or the ability to capture carbon emissions. So you have asphalt enabled, in a way, carbon capture technologies that, of course, can be a significant part of the answer to to dealing, mitigating the issue of carbon emissions. The initiative in Denmark now, this is another Sense and City and Habitat example. You know, how in Denmark we have a move already, I think, fully towards digital currency use that raises issues, as I mentioned in prior presentations, of human rights. Older people may not wish or are able to work with digital currencies. And that has become actually a big issue in the Scandinavian countries nowadays, from groups of older people and networks resisting that. But nonetheless, there's been strong push towards digitalization, strong push towards all of these things you see here in the data marketplace examples. And another one is about urban management, where different types of behavior are monitored, analyzed, and understood to support more effective and efficient movement of people, goods, and corporate activity. Again, this is trying to align with cyclical and sharing economy precepts and priorities. And integrating data and services at the urban level in cities is, again, an important component, modality, enabler of this. How that is protected, the encryption and protecting private data from breaches is a major challenge, and where the servers are. I mean, the cloud still has a presence physically somewhere. So this actually can become a sovereignty issue, even within Europe, and of course, certainly in a US versus European or other countries contexts, and global companies, credit card companies, but also Amazon and GAFA. The acronym stands for Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. Well, they are often challenged about what they do where with data. And this is not just about the GDPR legislation in Europe, but certainly it has been driven by, starting in May of 2018. The integration of data and services to support traffic. The idea is that mobility is seen as a need that has a solution that does not rely upon or require having your own car. In fact, it actively discourages that. And of course, in the context of a pandemic and other challenges, we need to be aware of how that can be best supported. But could be, time shared access and use to automobiles, including individual use automobiles, but of course also mass transportation and so forth. And you optimize constraints and objectives here, try to figure out better ways forward to minimize waiting times, to optimize resource use, and so forth. Now, this Industry 6.0 vision that I mentioned in the beginning is the next level. We're way, we have a long way still going forward to see some kind of reasonable, extended implementation of Industry 5.0 and Society 5.0 paradigms. So this is, again, a vision. I think visions can be very helpful, though. The idea is that we define the possibility and the goal and the objective of benign role and use of technology, including in starting artificial intelligence. The recent purchase of Twitter by Elon Musk, who has been, how should I say, making a lot of comments on Twitter, among other places, about the risks of AI, is an interesting point of reference. Hopefully this is going to really be what he claims an effort to maintain and sustain transparency and openness and freedom of speech enabled by social media, and not some kind of other influence peddling scheme. And this is an example within this bigger context. If AI truly ends up, because of our efforts as organized civil societies and citizens, truly ends up being a servant to humanity, we could truly minimize, if not abolish, corruption, waste, ensure transparency, in a sense, get to a point where the democracy versus autocracy dilemma would no longer exist. And I don't mean that in the sense of regime change, but really people would be empowered around the world to really bring about peaceful change and transition and transformation towards more democratic, more representative, and transparent circumstances. And this is the human and societal aspect, and the technological aspect is where technology itself is self-procreating in a way. Machines will design machines, and there will be the capacity to supply on demand whatever people may need. So scarcity and hunger and other things, divides of some type or other, will become minimized. This is sort of what I call the Star Trek vision with in that science fiction series from the 60s. Very interesting series with very significant social and political implications, even for today, about diversity, about equity, access to resources. In a way, it is a vision where technology helps achieve what many political movements have proclaimed as their vision and have served as their siren, in a way, call to people to abolish scarcity and abolish wants. This is something, of course, we'll have to see, because technology can also be used to introduce scarcity, as we've discussed. And I'm not naive about this. Human nature, I mean, this is Faustian at its heart. Human nature and technology, they both have a good side and a dark side. So how do we implement, some thoughts on the implementation, actually design and implementation of more effective and efficient approaches, policies, and practices. One example could be using this smarter, sustainable specialization strategy approach, more effective and efficient, or efficacious, that is ambidextrous, robust, and resilient in its nature. And that means that you're creative, you're structured and organized, but you're also creative and thinking beyond the box. And you do so in a way that is robust and resilient, so that in the end you design solutions that are both sustainable and smart. One important point of reference is to identify what you focus on, identify what you measure, and identify how you integrate it in your planning and your stock taking and your adaptation mechanisms. So you look at posture, propensity, and performance factors. You see here the examples, things like culture, competition, and knowledge relates to the posture. That may apply to, again, in the context of the Quintuple Innovation Helix, different stakeholders and their posture. Propensity applies to, to how they tend to operate and behave and respond. So there are processes, routines, and capabilities, and then performance relates to results, output, short, medium, and long-term results, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. They all shape and frame original and sectoral innovation capabilities and development and the underlying supporting systems. So again, the 3P is the posture, propensity, and performance in the smarter, sustainable specialization strategy. That's the 3PS4 framework, and how that could be implemented in the research and innovation smarter specialization strategies, RIS3 context. So we looked at the process or the methodology that had been developed for S3, and we grouped them and aligned and connected with these steps, the posture, propensity, and performance aspects, and the underlying attributes or factors, again, that we showed here: culture, processes, and so forth, and results. Examples, whether it's human capital or entrepreneurial culture. So we have, in terms of posture, examples of pillars, dimensions, and indicators. How do we bring to bear different investments in different things, including and starting with education, but also governance, transparency, quality of government, and also risk acceptance, cultural transformation in that sense. And then propensity is about government effectiveness. It's about being willing to start a business, being expenditures on R&D, research and development, but also what is happening in terms of smarter specialization, smarter sustainable specialization strategies, interventions, like what is the number of projects approved and what are the funds approved and the investments approved. So what is not just the quantity, but also the quality of innovation being developed and sustained. And then the results in terms of short, medium, and long-term effect. You see examples in terms of the outputs, SMEs in sectors of intervention, fund execution, employment increase, number of enterprises and especially startups collaborating with universities, outcomes, business outcomes, and structural change. And we see things like exports, employment, and value added and investments. These are all indicators that we have used to develop a sense of how things are developing, where they're going. And long-term effects, growth per se, and productivity and competitiveness enhancement, and things that actually are, again, sustainable and long-term. They're not just blips. They're not aberrations, but they actually reflect a coherent and resilient long-term trend. Employment, equality, and quality of life, and environment are things that we look at in terms of sustainability. And that is sustainability of society, economy, and then, of course, democracy. I'm just showing these as different things, different methods that we used in terms of making choices and decisions, and trying to figure out how to fuzzify this. This is a big part of the challenge here. And in an earlier presentation in the doctoral workshops, especially, I talked about using the entropy function as a way to support this effective and efficient drive towards effective and efficient design of policies and practices. So one of the things here is that there is, in reality, often gray areas, fuzzy areas for that matter. It's not black or white, and this has often been a challenge to capture and measure. As a result, we tend to ignore that, and that's where actually the biggest opportunities and insights can lie. And so this is how we frame the calculus, the reasoning, the trade-offs. It's about innovation, efficiency, and effectiveness. We would like to go towards both as high as possible, high performance and high efficiency, upper right quadrant, doing the right things right, where you thrive, and being aware that you have the other three. And so you need to move away from doing things with low efficiency and performance, where you die slowly, but even surviving or even dying quickly, being highly efficient but not effective, are states of being socially and economically that you want to avoid. Now, this is the challenge with the different disruptions, including energy. There has been a movement and a progress and a transition towards the upper right quadrant in many contexts, in many sectors, and in many countries as well as regions. There's been a regression the impoverishment, if you wish, of the middle class and other things that are negative changes. There's been a regression away from the upper right quadrant towards the other three. And this is something we need to both measure and fight against. And this is an example, again, I won't go into this, but this is an example of how you actually reduce this to specific data and measurements, where we look at the relative performance versus efficiency diagram, effectiveness versus efficiency diagram for regional innovation systems. And that obviously always is in the context of the helices. We have the knowledge economy, but also the knowledge society and democracy in mind. We want to support economy, society, and democracy, not just economy. And the way this is happening, and to a great extent supported by technology and artificial intelligence, is through higher order learning. This is what we call the Mode 3 knowledge production systems, building on prior examples and paradigms. Mode 1 and 2, they would fit into, they're more linear basically. The Mode 1 is fully linear, and this is related to the innovation models, also the linear one directional innovation model. And then there is the chain link model that aligns with Mode 2. Mode 3 is a chain linked model where you have also higher learning, learning to learn, and learning to learn how to learn levels of learning and capability development in place. And you explicitly and proactively support and develop those to make you as much as possible effective and efficient, to make as superior choices and frame, in that sense, policies and practices in the context of challenges and constraints that sometimes may appear to be not manageable, not sustainable. So the quadruple and the quintuple helix are really where Mode 3 knowledge production system finds its realization and presence. That's why we developed this paradigm to also complement and differentiate from the Mode 1 and 2 and the triple helix. So this is something I showed earlier. I believe this is about how the 3P, again, posture, propensity, and performance can manifest itself in the quadruple helix. And actually, this is different from the earlier matrix. Here we have, again, civil society, university, industry, and government, as I showed earlier, but in this earlier matrix, we looked at technology, culture, and so forth. Here we have posture, propensity, and performance in terms of output, outcome, and impact that are really identified, targeted, and measured. So we look at posture, propensity, and short, medium, and long-term results related to government, industry, university, and civil society sectors. What are the long-term effects also in that sense? And of course, what is the posture and the propensity that sets conditions for the best possible outcomes and results? So we want to encourage those and both measure for those and support those. This is what this rubric outlines. And how this can be further implemented in the Industry 5.0 report by the European Commission. They talk about data, information, and knowledge. We have discussed this in the form of, as I said, KID analytics, KID analytics, a few years back, preceding, in fact, the European Commission report for Industry 5.0, and the core rubric for integrating or implementing the data, information, and knowledge analytics modalities is shown here, where you basically bring together metrics, measurement, monitoring, and management, what I call the M4 challenge or conundrum, regarding posture, propensity, output, outcome, impact, dimensions or metrics, and looking at results that manifest, and this is taking us back to the quadruple helix metrics that I just showed here. Knowledge acquisition, learning competencies development, but also sustainable entrepreneurship and robust competitiveness. If these things are introduced and implemented as effectively and efficiently as possible, and then you end up having a digital innovation ecosystem developing that is effective and efficient, that also would be, as a result, resilient and intelligent or smart, you would have these things, these sort of happy developments manifest. Knowledge acquisition, learning competencies would be both highly developed, and they across time continue being developed. And then sustainable entrepreneurship, culture and practices, but also policies, and robust competitiveness as a result would emerge. That means robust competitiveness means that you're not operating on a you disaggregate in a way from comparative advantage considerations. You become less vulnerable, less exposed and dependent and vulnerable on disruptions like energy, and you have high-end, high value-added products and services that are required and needed and sought regardless, and for up to significant price range, significantly broad price range. So even if you have price inflation, you will still have resilient and sustainable demand. The sensitivity of demand to price fluctuations is very low in this context, and that's what robust competitiveness is about. You develop sustainable competitive advantage that is not based on comparative endowment factors and other things. It's really more about high-end, high-tech solutions that are unique and highly differentiated and lead to robust and resilient attributes in your economy and by extension your society. How knowledge is being, and especially data information and knowledge, can be integrated and leveraged is reflected here, drawing upon the work of March 30 years ago, is internal, external exploration and exploitation processes where you gain know-how, you use know-how, you identify new possibilities, and you grab these opportunities. All of these are part of your landscape, your operational landscape. The idea again is to journey through that as effectively and efficiently as possible and as fast as possible compared to what others may be doing. This is part of the sustainable competitive advantage mindset. And that also could be captured, indicated, and in that sense help understand what's happening in an efficiency frontier graph, where we show how our enhanced absorptive capacity for knowledge and data information and knowledge, for that matter, actually pushes outward the efficacy, not just efficiency. I would call it frontier. That's why I would talk about effective efficiency, and this is done by bringing together different assets and capabilities, and this requires a holistic approach. So design thinking is a very important modality in how you implement on that. You look at business viability, people desirability, and technological feasibility in your solutions. If you think about it, design thinking, it's been around since the 1960s. Is a very important modality underlying and supporting the development and the integration of society 5.0 and industry 5.0 modalities and solutions, because it looks at emotional process and functional innovation. It builds on intelligence I mentioned before in prior presentations, intelligence that is actually, of course, natural. But then we also have emotional intelligence and artificial intelligence, all kinds of intelligence, for that matter, needs to be developed, leveraged, and integrated in our solutions. And in the end, we have innovation that enhances and advances in an effective and efficient manner the user experience, whether that is an individual or an organizational entity or even a country. So that there is adoption and loyalty and, again, sustainable competitive advantage for our solutions. And the other aspect, along with design thinking, is the agile methodology approach, because we need to remember and realize that, again, to leverage fully higher order learning capabilities requires and implies that we actually have, as we said already, fully integrated the ability to observe, analyze, learn, adapt, and then keep testing and adapting and evolving, improving, driving the effectiveness and efficiency frontier, and being, in that sense, fully flexible and modular in our approaches. So we don't have a one-pass, top-down design, solution, and implementation. We rather have an iteration, a succession rather of iterations of the type we show here, where we have analysis and design, implementation, testing, evaluation, planning, and requirements, sort of a prototyping of a solution. We look at what the results are, we get user feedback, and we incorporate that in the next iteration. So you may have 2 or 3 or more, in fact, generations of interim products, solutions for that matter, product, services, policies, because this applies also, and this is significant, I believe, inside of our paper. This is a paper that recently appeared in the Journal of the Knowledge Economy, the ambidextrous, robust, resilient impact assessment strategies for smarter, sustainable specialization strategies. In fact, this is a paper that appeared recently and discusses in detail these issues here. So the point here is that we have a succession of iterations for, in a way, continual improvement and enhancement of effectiveness and efficiency, and as it may relate to products, services, policies, and practices. It's not just about entrepreneurial activity, it's about policy making as well. Agile is superior to traditional development, using and leveraging this modular, flexible iteration, succession iterations approach. You see that here. And it's superior in terms of visibility, adaptability, business value, and risk. So that has implications not only in terms of the cost of development, but also the effectiveness and efficiency of adoption and visibility and so forth. As you integrate more proactively lead users and co-developers, as you make your society as citizens, in effect, and other stakeholders, individual or institutional, involved in the design and development and the implementation of policies and practices, that makes those policies and practices much more, they are owned by a much larger group of stakeholders than just the elite policymakers. So here is now the 7 P's I mentioned earlier. We move from the 3 P's, posture, propensity, and performance, to another set of P's that relate and reflect attitude and also behavior. The 3 P's reflect and relate to organizational, more than anything, capabilities. And then here we have individual, but also organizational in the cultural sense, attributes, attitudes, and behavior. Attributes of attitudes and of behavior. So we have patient, persistent, persevering, and proactive. These are attributes of one's attitude or an organization's attitude. And then predictive, preventive, and preemptive is a behavior, and it's shaped by these attributes. If you think about it, to the extent that one actually managed to implement such a construct, such a framework for policy making and practice, formulating and implementing, it would be much more resilient against disruption, whether it is pandemic disruption, Ukraine invasion disruption, or what have you. So this is in fact, and the paper was is describing to some extent work we have done in consultation with the European Commission and in response to a request they made to help them plan better for the future, to be more robust and resilient against unexpected disruptions. And that started in 2019. In fact, it was, ironically, it preceded both the pandemic and Ukraine. And so, you know, it proved to be interestingly prophetic. We'll see how that actually helps improve things, because these things, in theory, so to speak, in a clinical context, they may appear obvious to be choices, preferences, and choices to be made. But when you do these things, you introduce a transparency and accountability, and also you empower stakeholders that may be not the intent or may not even be welcome by certain networks of power and interest. Again, I don't mean to sound cynical, and this can be easily misconstrued and abused and taken out of context to support efforts that are populist in nature, including the Brexit, for instance, or other things. And so, but there is an issue here, which is that what this is about is making more effective and efficient governance and policy making at the continental level, and as an extension, introducing a transparency and accountability that could be disconcerting to, so to speak, in quotes, public servants. Okay, so this is about the struggle for democracy. Going back to the title of today's presentation, how could yes, democracy and the environment are endangered species. How could we enhance their survivability and sustainability? One of the practical, concrete ways, in my mind, is to adopt, introduce, implement, and develop further such methods. So this is about, smarter, sustainable specialization strategy steps in terms of analysis of governance vision priorities, policy mix monitoring, priorities, policy mix monitoring, priorities, policy mix monitoring. These three relate to proactive, predictive, preventing, and preemptive. So at first, we look at the governance and the governance vision. And we, again, remember I said that democracies have the challenge of too short-term. Short-termism is an issue with democracies focused on the next elections. So you have to figure out a way to be both patient, but also persistent and persevering in your pursuit of substantive and beyond the box thinking goals and mindsets. And you also have to be proactive in how you pursue and implement those. The proactive attribute, so to speak, connects the patient, persistent, and persevering attributes with the predictive, preventive, preemptive attitudes, or attributes rather, that define behavior, which behavior is enabled to a great extent by technology. Data, information, and knowledge analytics is what can give you nowadays, using artificial intelligence modalities, among other contexts, real-time capability to know and understand, even at the individual level, what one's mindset and expected behavior may be. Now, again, there's two sides to this. There's the democracy enhancing aspect or side, and then there's the autocracy empowering dimension, which relates to, for instance, things like, a movie came out 25 years ago, Minority Report with Tom Cruise, where in the science fiction movie, where in the future technology will really define very accurately, presumably, who would be committing a crime in the future, and they would be arrested, to preempt and prevent criminal behavior. So, habeas corpus and the assumption of innocence and all that were long gone and forgotten. Now you can imagine what that world would be like. And this is the sobering aspect, but in a more, how should I say, optimistic and positive sense, having the capacity to be predictive, preventive, and preemptive as much as possible, even not fully, but partly more than what we are today, would make us much more robust and resilient and protected again in the end against disruptions. And that's very significant for people, citizens of democracies, and their expectations and faith in democracy. Okay, so this is a multi-stage, this is the model for multi-stage ambidextrous 7 Ps and risk-free development. You see how these attributes, and you see feedback, feed-forward, and self-organizing loop connections here. Learning is very highly developed and leveraged in this context. We realize, again, that's why we talk about design thinking and agile methodology in the approach. We realize that, this is an ongoing real-time dynamic sense system, and the solution or set of policies that need to be very reflective of realities that change dynamically. And that could be very exciting, in fact, whether it applies to economic development policies, whether it applies to taxation policies. We have some other work and related, in fact, publications on. This is something we'll discuss in one of the upcoming sessions on living labs experiments, where we talk about nonlinear taxation policies, where these aspects are to some extent incorporated. So this is about really envisioning a future where, the government and the state is both smart and benign, and that in practice and in reality may appear to be too naive and maybe a contradiction in terms, but again, in the Industry 6.0 vision context, this is certainly my hope. Okay, coming to close now. This is putting together everything. You see here how the agile and the design thinking, the agile methodology and the design thinking approaches support advancing, enhancing the efficacy frontier in terms of exploration and exploitation of options and choices. And all that is part of an integrated, ambidextrous, robust, resilient impact assessment, smarter, sustainable specialization strategy. Set of, again, policies and practices, right? So you see the axes here are learning and ambidexterity. We aim and hope to advance the frontier and move towards higher levels of learning capability and also ambidextrous thinking as citizens, as societies, and as economies. This is the idea that advances openness, inclusiveness, diversity, and of course flexibility and modularity. And then as a result, robustness, resilience, and sustainable competitive advantage in that sense. So the toolbox, the set of tools and modalities that is included in this, it could be a collection that we would define as the ARTIA S4 toolbox. We see here, and these are the things I've gone over today in brief, but hopefully clearly enough. So we talked about hypotheses going forward, the impact on the future of work and the future of life in a way, on society and the economy. What we need to realize and remember is that it is both naive and maybe too oversimplifying to think of these things in a static or one-dimensional manner. In other words, the impact of artificial intelligence on jobs, for instance, you can try to understand it freezing everything and looking at, doing what-if scenario on the economies and societies and the jobs and the technologies. But the reality is that everything changes, and in response to a certain change, that is adaptiveness, both resistance and adoption, and then further development and learning. So this is a very highly nonlinear and complex process that it's very difficult to predict. You can try to influence it as much as possible using the approach that I described, among other things, the ARTIA methodology. But the reality is we simply don't know. And I choose to be more optimistic than not. So there's going to be a qualitative change in labor. And the more flexible and adaptive you are, the better the future will be for you, with more or less technology. I mean, this has been the case. The issue here is with the people who cannot adapt, who are either too old or too embedded in certain ways and means of living and operating. And that's where the challenge for society and Society 5.0, for instance, comes into play and place. And the challenge for Europe as a civilized set of societies. We cannot just dump people, because that's exactly what some would like and would think in terms of effective and efficient approach. This is exactly wrong. And we talked about human, emotional, and artificial intelligence. In fact, emotional intelligence, in my mind, is the bridging factor, the integrative device that will combine human intelligence with artificial intelligence in the most effective and efficient way possible. This is part of our ongoing research and development and publications. And then here, the impact on democracy and the quality of democracy. Again, this is the challenge and an opportunity. It's not clear that this will play out fully in the short to medium term. In our estimation, autocracies will appear to be more enhanced by technology. Medium to long term, and this is a function to a great extent of the, again, robustness, resilience, and the 7 Ps and the 3 Ps of democracies, how robust and resilient they will prove to actually stay in the game, sustain challenges from autocracies, and turn the autocracies into democracies. I'm not talking about regime change and more wars, of course. I'm hoping for more bottom-up peaceful transformation taking place. So over the medium to long term, our fundamental belief and premise, and this is going back almost 10 years, is that true and transparent democracy constitutes a sine qua non for smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. So this is where the quintuple helix comes into play and place, and how and why it matters. We need to have a systemic approach, quoting Plato again here, and we need to demand, in fact, that our leaders, whether they're kings or elected officials, are philosophical enough in their approach. They should not just be, good players in sort of the game theoretic context, aiming for short-term advantages. They should also have the bigger picture, longer-term context in mind and serving it, even to the detriment of their own short-term benefits and interests. This is the essence of servant leadership that we need to have more than not, and more today than ever, I think. Thank you. We have 5 minutes, and this is